Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back to more Conversations in the Digital Age. Our subject is presidential politics. With a little less than a year to go before the 2016 presidential election, we see unfolding a highly fluid situation as the campaigns move forward. As King Lear said, who's in, who's out, who's up, who's down? The answers change from day to day. Hillary Clinton's campaign was a few weeks ago, some said, in a death spiral. Today, she appears to be the Democratic frontrunner. And what are we to make of the seesaw Republican fight for the nomination where, according to the latest polls, two outsiders, Trump and Carson, are in a statistical dead heat for the lead? Early days, but with us to help make some sense of it all is one of the keenest observers of the political scene I know, our friend Doug Schoen. Doug is a political analyst and pollster for Fox News. Reading the political tea leaves is what he does like no other. He's the author of 10 books on political subjects, and his last, Hopelessly Divided, The New Crisis in American Politics and What It Means, published in 2012, is an international bestseller. Required reading for informed political discussion. Doug Schoen, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Jim.
Well, now, Doug, what are the issues in this campaign?
Well, there are two ways to answer that question. There's the issues that the candidates themselves are talking about, and then there are arguably the real issues. The candidates themselves, as you heard last night, are talking about banks being too big to fail, immigration, tax reform. I think the biggest issue facing the American people is the moribund economy, and how do we get to a much more higher level of growth with greater job creation along the lines of the most recent job numbers.
Well, they touched on that, didn't they? They talked about tax reform as a way of stimulating the economy in their view. And they also talked about immigration policy as a way of protecting American wages.
Well, they did, and I think you would agree with me that neither of those discussions really fully amplified, or I dare say edified, people about the issue of how do we stimulate growth.
What about income equality? Does that figure at all in the campaign?
You know, I think there's a real debate that hasn't been held yet, and we'll see it in the fall, I hope, between Democrats who believe that addressing income inequality through redistribution is a central goal of government, and those who believe that the central goal of government is to promote and provoke growth so that we get, as John F. Kennedy once said, rising tides lifting all boats.
Now, you didn't mention foreign policy.
I did not.
Now, with ISIS acting up in the world, the Middle East, cauldron, Russia player, I mean, the country seems seriously challenged.
And that was certainly Marco Rubio's point last night, and I think he was eloquent in saying it. I think the challenge Secretary Clinton's going to have, as the Democratic nominee, certainly likely to be that, is how does she distinguish herself from Obama, who she served as Secretary of State, at the same time offering a compelling set of alternatives to a set of policies that I think many Americans feel have not been as successful as they could have been.
Well, because the problem is that we have these debates, and the skills that are involved in getting the nomination, getting elected, are not necessarily skills of statecraft that would help the commander-in-chief forge his way through these various problems.
Well, that is very much true. I mean, somebody like Jeb Bush, I think, would be a very good president. I think it's incontrovertible now, Jim, that he is a less successful candidate.
Hillary has a great deal of baggage, doesn't she? I mean, she voted for our going into Iraq. Obama wasn't in the Senate then, so he says he would have been against it.
He said he made a speech, I think, in, was it Lincoln Park at a rally in, was it 2003, where he spoke against it. At least that's the report that I seem to remember. Hillary's problem is she's got that. Then there's the other question of what is it she precisely accomplished as Secretary of State. And then there's the question that she famously presided over the reset with Russia, which doesn't look like it's worked all that well from my perspective now. And I think she certainly has experience, but as Rubio suggested last night, there are two sides to that coin.
And she also presided over the pivot to Asia.
She did.
Which had the effect of giving up one interest for another and disengaging from the Middle East, perhaps too soon in the view of many. And that's what led to the rise of ISIS and the present problem.
Well, that is certainly true, and we also have seen in the Obama administration the empowerment of the Iranians, and it still is very much an open question is whether the deal, the nuclear deal, is going to be the salutary development that the President and Secretary Clinton have said it will be.
Well, we hear a lot about deals these days. Of course, Donald Trump wrote a book called The Art of the Deal, and his answer to all this is that he's a great negotiator and could have made a better deal than the Trans-Pacific Trade Pact and could have made a better deal than the Iran deal. Is there anything to that?
Well, yeah, I think there's something else, Jim. As I listened to him last night, he basically was saying he wants the U.S. to be strong and tough, yes, but also to recede in influence. So his attitude was leave Syria to the Russians. Let's disengage. Now, doesn't happen to be my view. It doesn't happen to be the view of a lot of people. But it also is not a completely unintelligent or unpopular view. And there are two streaks in the Republican Party, indeed the electorate. One is isolationist. The other is a more muscular neoconservative view.
Another issue, which all the candidates on the Republican side seem to agree on, is the role of the media. They all think the media is bad. They all think the media has been unfair. Does that resonate well with the American people?
More so than you would imagine. There's a sense that the media is complicit with the governing class, creating a society where those that are rich and powerful have special interests and influence, and those that are ordinary folks are just left out. So there's a sense that the media is out of touch and candidly leans to the left.
Which brings up, since we've mentioned Donald Trump, the role of outsiders in the campaign. On the Democratic side, we have Bernie Sanders, who is outpolling Hillary in New Hampshire. On the Republican side, we have two outsiders, Donald Trump and Ben Carson. Now, they've struck a chord somehow with the American people, and how did they manage to do that?
Well, a couple of things. First, you were kind enough to mention my book, Hopelessly Divided, and what I argue there is that there are two strains of populism. Left populism, which says redistribute, right populism, which says get out of my life, government, business, whatever, leave me be. And I think
that's Rand Paul.
And that's Rand Paul, but it's also Trump and Carson in their own way, and they're saying anybody who's been in government is complicit. And there's so much anger in the Republican Party, witness feelings towards Boehner and McConnell, that I think Carson and Trump are doing well, sometimes because of their outsider status and sometimes in spite of it. They just are responsive to people's desire for alternatives. Sanders hit a responsive chord before the debates with his calls for taking on millionaires and billionaires. But candidly, when he said he didn't care about Hillary's, quote, damn emails, I think he lost a lot of juice.
That was the end of the race as far as on the Democratic side, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, that was what I saw. When Hillary and she shook hands, I took that as tantamount to a declaration of I was about to say non-candidacy. That's a little extreme, but certainly a non-aggression pact.
Last night, it seemed that the seasoned politicians, Rubio, Cruz, Bush, dominated the debate and over Trump and Carson, who kind of talked in generalities.
The voters themselves do not necessarily see debates that way, the way you do, and frankly, the way I do. Now, we've seen Carson and Trump maintain their lead in spite of not having great debate performances. Rubio and Cruz have been going up steadily. But still, you have Trump and Carson in the mid-20s and Rubio and Cruz, best case, low teens.
Okay, so before we get to the Republicans, you have Hillary, whose campaign had been steeped in allegations of scandal, Benghazi, emails. Has she put all that behind her?
Well, we'll see. We'll see what the FBI does. We'll see what the Justice Department does. I think the president himself signaled his view when he said on 60 Minutes that he didn't think it was a national security issue, the way she used her emails. At the same time, she did sign documents indicating that if she negligently handled top secret information, she was liable for prosecution. So that's what the FBI and Justice Department are apparently actively determining right now.
Well, Richard Haas said months ago that if no classified information was found on a private server, it was case closed and it was a ho-hum. But then classified information was found on a private server.
That's my point.
And it seems to have just blown over. I mean, no one seems to care.
Jim, if there's one person in New York who I would not need to say what I'm saying to, it would be you, but let me say it. In most investigations, the prosecutors, the investigators, try to keep their own counsel until they reach a conclusion. I think there is every reason to believe that Secretary Clinton did not have any criminal intent, that there was no desire for her to use her private server to traffic in classified information. I think that's pretty clear. At the same time, the standard is not intent, it's negligence for criminality, and they've got to determine if, in fact, there was, in the, I think, dissemination of some intelligence officers' names and some secrets about North Korea. So to me, it's an open question, but if I had to bet here, and Jim, I have come on this program, I have made fearless predictions, and you have told me that my viability as a future guest is determined based on the quality of my predictions.
Well, you're here.
And I'm back, yeah. And so I will make my first of a number of predictions now. I believe that there will be no charges filed against Secretary Clinton.
No charges filed. Now, 3 or 4 months ago, you said her campaign was in a death spiral.
It was.
3 or 4 months ago, she was kind of acting like a driver who's had 10 accidents and who drives not just with due care, but with so much care that they don't make much progress. Seems stalled. Now what's happened?
I think she benefited from Bernie Sanders not taking her on, not taking on issues with email. And also, candidly, in that Democratic debate, she was by far the best contender. And she did a great job. And since Sanders didn't attack and she attacked him, I think it was game over.
Who would be her best running mates if she's nominated?
Boy, I don't really have a good answer to that one. There's been talk about Julian Castro.
She can't run with someone named Castro.
Well, I think she could do that, but certainly not somebody from 90 miles south. I don't know.
How about Tim Kaine or Sherrod Brown?
Yeah, I've heard those names mentioned. Sherrod Brown would bring her Ohio. Tim Kaine, I guess perhaps Virginia. But I don't see an overarching reason to pick either of them other than demographics. I don't think she'll pick Bernie Sanders. Don't think she'll pick Elizabeth Warren. Don't think she'll pick Cory Booker, but don't know who she'll ultimately pick.
For once, I've stumped the star.
You have.
Doug Schoen has no prediction.
I don't, but we got 9 months.
All right, we have 9 months. Well, maybe we'll see what happens.
Exactly.
Now, the debate last night sort of stacked up as more of a series of stump speeches than a debate, with each one sort of tooting his or her own horn. Who do you think scored the most points?
I think Marco Rubio.
And why do you say that?
Because he had a vision of the future that was hopeful and optimistic. He had a critique of the Obama administration. And I think he's a likable guy. Now, I don't think Carson hurt himself. What I wrote on my blog was, I said, he was compelling on the issues he cares about, which is a number of the social issues. He seemed out of his depth on the economy.
He's kind of spongy, isn't he?
Yeah. Trump, he was more likable, but again, I didn't have an overarching sense of command. Cruz is very, very good. It's just he's appealing to an audience that is very narrow, and I just don't see him as ultimately electable, perhaps even not nominatable. I thought Jeb Bush was somewhat better, but didn't really reverse things. So I remain, I guess if I had to predict, Jim, singing for my supper or lunch as it may be, I'd say that Rubio did himself the most good.
Now, of course, Cruz made a big gaffe. He said he would do away with 5 agencies, including the IRS, and then he couldn't name them.
Did he refer people to Rick Perry?
He referred people to Rick Perry. But were there any other major gaffes in the debate?
I thought when Cruz said he would let big banks fail, it's the sort of thing that will probably get him votes in the primary. But on the off chance he gets nominated, I'm hard-pressed to believe he can go into a national election saying he'd close down the government, close down the banks, but we shouldn't worry.
He wants women to die in childbirth, so
yeah, I mean,
it's not a good tack to take. Now, what about Kasich?
I think he didn't do himself any good. He says
came on too strong.
Yeah, I was going to say he's a sort of contentious guy. I've debated him a few times myself, Jim, and he has a pretty thin skin, and I think we saw evidence of it last night.
Yeah. Well, of course, Carson is supposed to have a thin skin too. I mean, he wrote about his uncontrollable temper, that he raised a hammer to his mother and hit someone else with a chain and a lock, and then his closest friends say that never happened. Is he able to get around that? They kind of raised that question, and he said, well, what about Hillary? None of it made much sense.
It doesn't make much sense. I mean, most people don't lie about domestic violence or the like, and
so if he did it, it's bad, and if he didn't do it, he's not telling the
questions.
Truth.
Yeah, I mean, let's just say, I tend to judge people more on what they've done recently than their recollections of what happened 40-odd years ago, but it does, I think, raise legitimate questions. But I think he's going to end up being near or at the top of the polls after this debate as well.
Now, of course, all eyes are on Donald Trump because he's so upset the Republican calculus with Jeb Bush, the front runner, and he kind of dispatched Jeb Bush by just saying he wasn't energetic, perhaps an attack on his virility. And Jeb Bush began to decline in the polls. Has Trump really created chaos and disarray in the Republican Party?
Absolutely. I mean, Trump has taken a race that was supposed to be orderly and disciplined and turned it into really a free-for-all. And I think that the reason you alluded at the start to the fact that it's unpredictable is largely Trump and to a lesser extent Carson.
Well, do you think that's in the public interest that he did that? We would like to have a two-party system in this country.
Well, some of us would like a two-party system. Some of us feel that we'd be better off with a 3 or 4 or 5-party system.
Well, we're not there yet. So
we're not going to get there, I don't think, in my lifetime.
Not in your lifetime. So we have 2 parties, and the Republican Party is supposed to be a credible alternative to the Democrats, not just a minority party. And here they are completely shattered by the candidacy of Donald Trump. Amazing phenomenon.
On the other hand, don't we want parties to be open enough that people who want to present themselves, who have alternative views or perspectives, should be able to go forward? I mean, the fact that the greatest nation in the world has only 2 parties and it's in a largely elite-controlled system is, to me, disquieting, hence hopelessly divided in other books I've written.
The conversation last night was much more substantive than prior Republican debates, and they seemed to focus on immigration with Trump's totally unworkable and impractical suggestion that we deport 11 million illegals who were here. It's estimated, of whom 6 million are probably Mexicans. I don't know where we deport the rest, but he has struck a chord that somehow or other their presence here has an effect on American wage earners.
Well, it is clear that for the middle class, wages have been stagnant or depressed. It is clear that people like to blame somebody else. And it is clear that Trump has, as you say, hit a responsive chord. And when he says deport them and build a fence and make Mexico pay, it sounds really pretty good. But I think it raises a larger question. the system itself is not dealing with people's concerns and fears, and Trump is very legitimately a protest against that.
Well, it's more than building a wall, because, of course, we have fences along the border, the Texas-Mexican border. There's a statute of Congress that authorized it. We do patrol the border. I don't know whether more walls solve the problem. It's quite amusing. Trump said, well, Mexico will pay for it. And so how do you get Mexico to pay for it? Well, from the remittances that the illegals send back to Mexico, we'll confiscate them. And who'll build the wall? He said, well, China, they're very good at building walls. So, I mean, it's created kind of a lot of humor and a lot of interest in his campaign. But here you have two candidates, Cruz and Rubio, of Cuban extraction. Rubio was never asked point blank last night what his position was on immigration. But isn't it ironic? Here you have two people from recent immigrant roots, and they say last one in, close the door.
Well, I think that is interesting. I also think you could quote Rubio when he was in the Gang of Eight being pro-immigration. You could quote him now being anti-immigration. It's just that Republican primary voters are really, really hostile on the subject, and hence the candidates take those positions a la Trump.
Let's just focus for a moment on Jeb Bush. And
Sure.
Of course, he's interesting. He's son of a president, brother of a president. He's been having a hard time. Did he stop bleeding last night?
I think he did okay, but I don't think he answered the question of why he should be president. And he didn't appear to be enjoying himself. There didn't appear a lot of optimism. And so he may have stopped the bleeding, but I think the wound is still there.
His tactic in the last debate was to take on Rubio.
His tactic in this one was to take on Hillary. Maybe a little better, but candidly, I don't know how you saw it. I just didn't really think he broke through.
Now, Rubio, whom you admire, at a gaffe, too, it was sort of a great line that we should have vocational training, and because welders make more money than philosophers. Actually, welders do not make as much money as philosophers. But do you think his proposal about more vocational training made any sense?
Yeah, I do. I think it's absolutely clear that universal college for all is something that is both illusory and too expensive. And I think we need a more robust vocational system that begins in our high schools and technical schools and should move to the two-year colleges. Absolutely.
And then you get down to the lower tier, perhaps the vice presidential candidates, Kasich, Paul, and Fiorina. Although I don't see any of them really running with any
I think they are all basically running for either credibility or cabinet jobs or ambassadorial positions. I mean, Carly Fiorina, I think, will be the number one attack dog against Hillary on the campaign trail. I don't see her doing much else, probably get a job in the administration. Christie's gotten better as a candidate, but still there are problems.
He was off the card last night.
Right, exactly. Rand Paul, I thought, did a better job, but I don't think this is a time for him. So I'm sort of skeptical.
So who is your favorite or your favorite choice for vice president on the Republican side?
Until last night, I would have said Rubio and Kasich would have been my ticket. I don't think Governor Kasich did himself much good. So, it's Rubio and whoever.
Well, how about Portman? That's Ohio.
Yeah, he's not as scintillating a character as Kasich. But on the other hand, if you don't win Ohio and you don't win Florida and you're a Republican, you don't win the election.
Now, when Hillary was stumbling, the dark horse who might have come into the race was Biden. And he realized after the debate there wasn't much hope for him. Is there any chance that the Republicans are in such disarray and are so scattered that Romney will come into the race?
I think there is some chance, but there's got to be a legitimate stalemate. And if there is such a circumstance to develop, the party leaders would literally have to summon Romney into the fray. That's the only way that could happen.
Now, let's have some Doug Schoen predictions.
Absolutely.
The polls show that Hillary beats any of these people.
Right.
Do you agree with that?
I believe that when we sit here in October of 2016 taping this program, you
And
will
we
ask
will.
the same question, and I will say that Hillary remains the front runner to be the next president of the United States, largely because in 5 of the last 6 elections, Democrats have won states with 241 of the 270 electoral votes they need. So my answer is a qualified and measured yes.
And under what circumstances might she lose?
Well, there are 2 scenarios. One, if I'm wrong and there are some charges brought that grow out of the probes that are going on now in the emails, that would obviously impact adversely. The second is I think Rubio has a very good answer to the question of why somebody of limited experience would be a credible alternative to Secretary Clinton. I think he's the strongest general election candidate as we sit here today. But given the issues with his finances, he too can be undermined. But I think Rubio theoretically offers a chance of beating her.
Well, I think we've run out of time. But
Jim,
Doug Schoen, thank you so much
It's
for
always
coming
a pleasure.
by. Always a pleasure. And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations in the digital age. I'm Jim Zirin. All the best and take care.